o'clock, so let's get going. And as I said, we're going to be talking about the addenda. It's going to be a pretty quick trip through all of the addenda so that we can touch on each of them. And I'm just going to talk about some of the high points of each addendum and situations in which you might use it. So I think I always say this, but as I go through this and I'm sharing my screen, I don't really monitor the chat. So if you have questions as we go along, just stop me. Just, unmute yourself, ask the question, and that way we can make sure we address it as we go along. Or if you'd rather save it till the end, that's fine also. Okay, everybody ready? Yes, and we are starting at 2. It's 2:01, but here we go. Okay, sharing my screen. And I believe I have everything all set up the way I wanted to do it in the order. So we'll see if it works, okay? All right, so can everybody see that? This is the document that I'll be sharing, and you probably have seen this before if you've been on the forum for a while, because this is the compilation of the series of posts that I did on the addenda. So it addresses everything in detail. You can read all about each addendum, and some of them have suggested scripts for when you talk to a seller or a buyer about that particular addendum. So that is that. The next one that we're going to talk about is the condo writer. On all of these, the introductory paragraph is going to be the same. So I'm just going to talk about it once. We always want to put the names of the parties, the seller and the buyer. Sometimes people don't fill that in completely. It's always a good idea to do it so that there's no question that these are the people that go with this contract. This is the addendum that goes with this contract, right? So that there's no ambiguity about, does this addendum really go with this contract? Fill it out. It doesn't take that long. And that way we're sure, right? So name of the seller and the buyer as they appear on the contract. And then it says property described as. So when we say described as, we're really talking about the legal description. However, for this purpose, I would say it's perfectly fine to put the address, because you're also going to have the address in the contract, right? So it ideally, perfectly, right, put the legal description. However, the address is also acceptable. And then you want to have the people initial it because that's important, right? Because in our introductory sentence, it says, if initialed by all parties, the clauses below will be incorporated into the contract. So that's important. You want to make sure that it's fully incorporated. And if you look at paragraph 19 in the contract, where it lists out all of these addenda, it has those same words that, the addenda check below, the writer's check below are incorporated into the contract. It's like magic words in the law. You want to make sure that all of these terms are incorporated into the contract so that they become part of the contract. So paragraph 1, we're just talking about, does the condo association have the right to approve the buyer? Yes, no. If it does, then you're going to put the date by which that approval needs to happen. We're also going to put the date by which the whole approval process is going to start. And the default is 5 days after the effective date. Paragraph 2 is right of first refusal. So there are 2 rights of first refusal that we talk about in paragraph 2. The first one is the condo association itself. And then the second one is the individual members. So the individual owners of the units in the condo community. They might have the right of first refusal. And I've actually seen this right exercised by the condo association. It does happen. And the buyer was just kind of out of luck in that instance because the condo association exercised the right to buy the property. Paragraph 3, we're talking about fees, assessments, prorations, litigation, anything of a financial nature that affects the property that will also impact the buyer's financial obligations if they buy the property. Then we talk more about the fees. We talk about special assessments and prorations. And this is interesting at paragraph C because it says any item on the agenda or reported in the minutes. So it doesn't have to be an actual final assessment. It's anything that's been discussed that could financially impact the buyer. Those are all important things to disclose. And then paragraph D is litigation. Paragraph 4 is the sprinkler system. Paragraph 5, so you see it says non-developer disclosure. Obviously, if it's the developer, then we're likely using a different contract. And the statutory disclosure requirements are different. Does everybody remember that from your pre-licensing class or maybe your broker pre-licensing class? The statutory documents that are required to be disclosed are different depending on whether it's the original developer or it's a resale seller. In this case, this is a resale seller. So these are all the documents that that person needs to provide. And it is a statutory requirement that the seller provide the condo docs. So we're going to check paragraph A, that the buyer acknowledges, yeah, I got everything, or paragraph B, that I don't have everything. And until I get everything, then I have the potential to terminate the contract because it says, and this is right out of the statute, the agreement is voidable by the buyer by notice within 3 business days after receipt of all of this stuff that's listed in that paragraph B. And it says current copies. So current copies of the deck, the articles of incorporation, the bylaws, the Q&A, the FAQ, all of those kinds of things must be the current versions. 2-3 years ago, an agent had a situation where the condo association had provided all of those documents. She in turn provided it to the buyer's agent. A couple of weeks later, past the inspection period, the condo association said, oops, we didn't give you the current version of the FAQ. Here you go. So it restarted that 3 business day time period. So the buyer had another opportunity to review and potentially terminate within that time period. So you want to make sure everything is provided in a timely fashion and everything is the most current version. Paragraph 6 is buyer request copies. Of course, the buyer should request copies. That's part of the due diligence that the buyer should be doing within the inspection period. Paragraph 7, this is only if the buyer has actually received the documents. You don't want to have the buyer pre-sign that because if they haven't received it, then when they sign that, they kind of waive that right to receive it and potentially terminate the contract within the 3 business day period. Paragraph 8 talks about common elements. Paragraph 9 is inspections and repairs. And then 10 is the governance form. That is a required document that must be provided. Questions about condo writer? Okay, next is Homeowners Association and community disclosure. This is when membership in the HOA is mandatory. If it's a voluntary thing, you know, some of them expired, they didn't get renewed. If it's voluntary, then this form is not required. If it's mandatory membership, then this form is required by statute. And this language at the top is right out of the statute. It says that this summary, and by summary, we're talking about this page, this addendum. This summary must be provided to the buyer before or at the time of signing the contract. If it's not, then the buyer has 3 days to terminate the contract. So here's the difference between this and the condo. The condo statute requires the seller to provide the actual documents. The HOA statute requires the seller to provide only this disclosure, not the documents themselves. So it's on the buyer to get the HOA documents. And a lot of agents want to be very helpful and get those and provide those. Don't do it because you open yourself up to liability, because what if they're not the most current version? and they've changed something that significantly affects what the buyer intended to do with the property. For example, this is a real life example. The HOA had changed the documents to have a waiting period before an owner could rent the property out. And this particular buyer was buying with the intent of renting the property out. And suddenly, after closing, discovered that there was a 1-year waiting period because the agent had not provided the most current versions of the documents. So it should always be up to the buyer to get the documents for an HOA situation. Here, we're going to have very similar information. We're going to put the amount of the fees, how much is it, how frequently is it paid, all of that kind of stuff. Are there any special assessments? And this is one of the instances where we're actually going to have the buyer sign. So the buyer signs on this page. Page 2 is a little more. Is the HOA entitled to approve the buyer? If so, we have that in paragraph 1. Are there any other fees or assessments that might affect the financial obligations of the buyer? If so, we're going to put it in paragraph 2. And then we want to have the contact information for the HOA management company, if there is one, or if it's just the association itself, contact information for that. All right, questions? All right, C is seller financing. So this has been coming up fairly regularly recently, where a seller wants to offer seller financing. If they do, make sure you use this addendum, and you'll notice that the first page is all just disclaimer about Dodd-Frank compliance. Because if the seller is a frequent flyer for seller financing, then they're going to have to comply with Dodd-Frank just like any other lender would. So that's why we have all this disclosure stuff on page 1. And then page 2 is the terms of the financing. When you're filling this in, that's all you should be doing. You should just be the scribe. Don't start suggesting terms. Don't start negotiating terms for the seller financing, because then you've stepped into the sphere of a mortgage loan originator, right? You can't negotiate financing terms. You can't suggest it. Just ask them, what terms do you want? And then you can fill in the blanks. It's up to them to decide what the terms are. It's also up to them to go to a lawyer and have the note and the mortgage drawn up. So it's a pretty complex thing. And it's just like any other lender would want, right? So send them off to the lawyers early to make sure that all those documents get done. D is assumption of existing mortgage. Probably not going to see this very much just because the interest rates are so relatively low and competitive, right? There may be some fluctuation, but it's unlikely that you'll see an assumed mortgage. If you do, this is the one to use. And it has basic information about the existing mortgage. Here's the balance, here's the interest rate, here's the term, all of that kind of stuff. And we also give the buyer an out that if there's a charge that has to be paid, it's not going to be more than X amount. And we can fill in that blank. It also says that if the lender, the seller's current lender, doesn't approve the buyer for the assumption, then the contract terminates. Obviously, if the contract is contingent upon assumption of the mortgage and the lender is not going to let the buyer assume, then we're not going to make the buyer buy the property. E is FHA VA. Paragraph 1 is definitions that apply to everything. Paragraph 2, we talk about inspections and appraisal. These terms apply to everything. Paragraph 3 applies only to FHA financing. And then paragraph 4 is going to apply only to VA financing. You can see down here, okay? And so you're going to check to indicate which is which. And then you just fill in your blanks. We talk about if the appraisal is less than X amount, right? And then it says that the buyer has the privilege, but is not obligated to proceed with the transaction if it doesn't come in at that amount that you specified. We also talk about the same thing for the VA financing. Paragraph 5 is election to proceed with the contract. So this tells us what happens if the buyer chooses to proceed despite the value, so the appraised value, right, by FHA or VA. The buyer needs to make the election within 3 days after they get the appraisal. Within 3 days after they get the appraisal. And then everybody signs this one, the buyer, the seller, and the buyer's agent, the seller's agent. It says broker. However, for our standard documents like this, typically your market center is going to authorize you to sign on behalf of the brokerage. So you as the agent would be able to sign this document. One thing, let me point out, and this has to do with all of them. This is just a housekeeping item. Please make sure you're using all of the addenda that have this footer in the left-hand corner, CR-5X. This is the form that you're going to match up with the standard and the as-is contracts. Sometimes we see the footer that says CRSP. That's a totally different contract. And the paragraph references in the addenda are going to be different between those two, right? So if you look back up here, when we refer to paragraphs in the contract, those paragraph numbers are going to be different in the CRSP contract. So if you use a CRSP contract, it's going to refer back to paragraphs that are different. Does that make sense? And anytime you have things like that going on, it creates ambiguity in your contract. And when there's ambiguity, there's always the potential to have somebody say, whoops, it's not even a valid contract. So the Florida Realtors Hotline says, don't mix and match your addenda. If you do, it doesn't necessarily mean that the contract is invalid. However, do you really want to take that chance? Probably not. So F is the appraisal contingency. And this is the source of a lot of questions, right? Especially now with the way the market is and appraisals are kind of coming in lower than what the sale price is. This just says that the buyer at the buyer's expense is going to get an appraisal by a certain date, and you fill in the blank. If you leave it blank, then the default is at least 10 days prior to closing. And then you're going to fill in the amount for what the appraisal needs to come back at. If the buyer gets the appraisal and it's less than the amount specified in this addendum, then the buyer has the option to terminate the contract. This is in subparagraph A right here. Terminate the contract, or waive the contingency and proceed with the contract. So those are the only two options. It doesn't say anything in here about, and the parties will renegotiate the price, right? So we see a lot of questions about, hey, I want to put in the contract that the buyer agrees to pay the price. Well, the contract already says that. You don't need anything else. The only option under this contingency is the buyer terminates or the buyer goes forward at the full purchase price, right? The seller is not obligated to renegotiate the price. This is the true appraisal contingency addendum. Paragraph 8B that talks about appraisal is not an appraisal contingency that protects the buyer. That language protects the lender, really, because it gives the lender an out to say, we're going to deny the loan if the appraisal comes back low, and it's so low that it's not going to support the loan to value ratio that we require for our underwriting guidelines. So you see the difference? This one is up to the buyer with the appraisal contingency addendum. The language in paragraph 8B is up to the lender to decide. So if the buyer is concerned and they want to make sure about the appraisal, then the contingency addendum is the one to use. You can't rely on the language in paragraph 8B. G is short sale approval contingency. Not seeing a lot of these. Hopefully we don't see a lot of these in the future. We'll see what happens, right? But it basically says that we have to get the lender's approval And of course, the lender is not a party to the contract, so we have really no leverage to make the lender agree to it. Nevertheless, we're relying on the lender to approve it. The seller is going to make the application to the lender to get the short sale approval. It's on the seller to do that, right? Because they're the ones who have the relationship with the lender. If the lender doesn't approve, then obviously the contract is going to terminate. If we don't hear back from the lender within a certain amount of time, the contract is going to terminate. And it says that, and this is the last paragraph, paragraph 10, if the lender forecloses before we get approval for the short sale, then the contract terminates, which makes sense, right? At that point, the lender owns the property, not the seller. All right, any questions as we move through this? I know we're going pretty quickly. Everybody good? Okay. Paragraph H, homeowners and flood insurance. I really like this one, and especially now because I'm hearing from my friends in the insurance industry that homeowners insurance is going up a lot. A lot of people are having their policies canceled, especially for older homes. It's tough to renew. The rates are way up. So this is one way that a buyer could be protected. And the same for flood insurance. And these are very similar. Basically, it says that if the buyer is not able to get homeowners insurance or flood insurance for a certain amount for the first year premium, that's all we care about, just the first year. We can't guarantee what happens after that, right? Then the buyer has the option to terminate the contract. And this could be really important for some people, depending on their budget. It's like, yeah, I have X amount to spend, and that's going to include my insurance. If my insurance goes way up, I can't afford it. So we give them an out. So that's H. There is no I. I was the old FERPTA addendum, which we do not use anymore because all of that language is now fully incorporated into the contract. So we're going to go right to J. This is the interest-bearing account. Typically, when people make the escrow deposit, it's a non-interest-bearing account. However, if there's like a large amount that's going to be put in escrow for a long period of time, then it might make sense to use this so that it can be put into an interest-bearing account. And if you remember from pre-licensing, we have to disclose where's it going to be held and who's going to get the interest. So that's what this addendum is all about. Okay. Any questions about that? All right, I'm going to switch out my screens and show you another set of addenda. So hold on just a minute. Let me reshare. All right, can everyone see K as is? So K and L are the only two that are exclusive to the standard contract, which means don't ever, ever, ever use them with the as-is contract. And it's obvious why, right? K is the as-is addendum. It turns the standard contract into an as-is contract. It goes through there line by line. You'll see paragraph 9A1, general repairs, all of that, right? We're going to change all of those provisions in the standard so that it becomes an as-is contract. And yet I've seen agents submit this with the as-is contract. Don't do that because there's no need, right? It's redundant. Paragraph L, addendum L is right to inspect, right to cancel. So what this does is it turns the standard contract into a hybrid between the as-is and the standard. So what it says is during the inspection period, the buyer has the absolute right to terminate the contract, just like the as-is, right? If the buyer doesn't terminate within the inspection period, then all of those repair obligations in the standard contract kick in. And the seller then would be obligated to make all the repairs up to the limits that we put in paragraph 9A. So it really is kind of the best of both worlds for a buyer. And I like it. I think it's a good approach. It's just a matter of whether a seller is willing to accept it, right? M is defective drywall. So there's some back and forth about what are the years during which this should be used. And the guidance that I've seen gives a wide range. It's like from 2002 all the way up to about 2008 or 9. And then I also know agents who use it on every single transaction. So what this is getting at is that time period during which there was a lot of usage of defective drywall. There was a drywall shortage, so people started getting it from other sources. It turned out it was defective, right? It emits sulfurous odors and corrosive materials. And so it can actually do a lot of damage to like the pipes, the wiring, all that kind of stuff, not to mention the odors, right? Who wants to have the house smelling like rotten eggs? So this is when you would use it, right? If the home is constructed during those time periods. And you can specify the amount of the repairs. So in paragraph 2B, it says that if the repairs exceed X amount, and if you leave it blank, it's $500. Well, $500 is probably not going to get you very much in terms of repairing defective drywall. So make the number make sense if you're using this addendum. Any questions on defective drywall? No? Okay. N is coastal construction control line. So this is important because it's the line that goes around the coast, and on the water side of that line, development is restricted. So imagine that a house was built right there on the water, or it's right on the beach or something, and they extended the pool area beyond the line. And if something happens to the pool area, then they're likely not going to be able to repair it or replace it because they can't do anything on the water side of the line. So it's always a good idea for the buyer to get an as-built survey done to see exactly where the improvements fall in relation to that line. That's what this is all about. The first option is buyer waives the right to the survey, or buyer wants the survey, right? Always a good idea to get it, just because you never know. And water lines change, right? So what may have been okay at the time of construction, maybe it's not anymore. So that as-built survey is going to be very crucial so that the buyer knows what their obligations are going to be and what their rights are going to be with regard to maintaining and repairing the property. O is insulation disclosure for new residents. So sometimes I see agents using these contracts, the standard or the as-is, with new construction. And maybe it's a small builder, it's a one-off, typically the builders are going to have their own contracts, and this disclosure is included in the contract. This is a statutory requirement. If they don't have their own contract and they are using the standard or the as-is, then you want to make sure they use this because, like I said, it is a statutory requirement. The builder must disclose the insulation rating for the new construction. P is lead-based paint disclosure. And this is another one that's a little bit different because everybody gets to sign. So paragraph A is all about the seller's disclosure. The seller is going to disclose that they know about the presence of lead-based paint, or they don't know about the presence of lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazards. So they need to initial at A and check one of the options. Paragraph B is if I have any records or tests or anything related to lead-based paint. So I need to initial and then indicate that I do have some of those and I provided them to the buyer, or I don't have any of those reports. The next one, C, D, and E, has to do with the buyer. So paragraph C is buyer has received copies of everything above in paragraph B. If there is nothing, then the buyer doesn't need to initial at C. And typically that's the case, right? Most sellers are not going to have reports on lead-based paint. So they're going to check that second option at B, which means the buyer doesn't have to initial at C, but that is the only place where anybody has the option to initial or not initial. Paragraph D is buyer has received the pamphlet. This is a statutory regulatory requirement. The buyer must initial at D, and they must receive a copy of that pamphlet. Protect your family from lead in your home. And everybody should have access to that. Paragraph E is the buyer's right to inspect for lead-based paint. Buyer should initial and then check one of the options, that they either exercise the right to inspect or they waive the right to inspect. Paragraph F is for the licensee. Now let's scroll down a little bit. You see in the signature blocks, we say listing licensee and selling licensee. Does everybody see that? Yeah. And then look at F, it just says licensee. Licensee refers to anybody who receives commission or compensation, commission, right, from the seller. So that's probably everybody, right? The listing agent gets commission from the seller. The buyer's agent ultimately gets commission from the seller. So that means licensee at paragraph F refers to the listing agent and the selling agent, right? So if the listing agent flakes out and doesn't do it, or if it's a FSBO, then the buyer's agent needs to initial there. And what you're initialing is that you have informed the seller of their obligations under the law, and that you are aware of your responsibility to make sure that everybody complies, including the seller, right? So it's on us as licensees to make sure this is done right. And the reason I put so much emphasis on this is that HUD and EPA both have jurisdictional authority over lead, because it's in housing, which means HUD, and it's a toxic substance, which means EPA. There are potentially 13 violations on this one little page, and each violation could subject you to fines of up to $16,000 from EPA and from HUD. So that's a total of $32,000 per violation. So for me, at those numbers, it's really not worth arguing about an initial here or there, right? Let's just do it. Let's get the boxes checked. Let's get the initials in all the right spots, and then we don't have to worry about it. As I mentioned before, everybody signs. The seller signs, the listing agent signs, the buyer signs, the buyer's agent signs. Any questions about lead-based paint? Okay. Q is housing for older persons, and you're going to indicate which type it is. Remember, we have two types of housing for older persons. We have the 62 plus, and then we have the 55 plus. So you just indicate which type it is, and then that's all that's required for that. R is rezoning. So this is when the buyer has plans for the property that are for a different use and not consistent with the current zoning. And they only want the property if they can get it rezoned, right? So imagine, and you've probably all seen this in some of the downtown areas, as you're coming out of downtown, and they were residential. And now the character of the neighborhood is slowly changing so that it's more business. So you see the insurance agency, and you see the photographer, and you see the, you know, the whatever, the law office, and maybe a doctor's office. You see those kinds of changes happening block by block sometimes. And maybe a couple of blocks down, the zoning hasn't yet caught up with the change in the neighborhood, and the buyer wants to buy it to put a business office in, and they only want it if they can get the zoning changed. So that's what you're going to use to make sure that the buyer is protected for that contingency. S is lease purchase, lease option. So there's a difference. Lease purchase is I'm going to rent the property and I'm definitely going to buy it at some point, either during the lease term or at the end of the lease term. And lease option is I'm going to lease it and maybe I'm going to buy it. I don't know yet, but I have the option, right? Either during the term or at the end of the term. And what this says is the buyer and the seller are going to go see the lawyer. They're going to get all of these documents drawn up, and we're going to say who's going to pay for it, right? The buyer, the seller, or they're going to split it equally. It says that if we don't get those agreements drawn up within the time stated, which is 5 days after the effective date, then the contract shall be terminated. That sounds like it's an automatic termination. My suggestion is always, you're never going to get this done within 5 days after the effective date. You're probably not even going to get in to see a lawyer within 5 days. So make that time period make sense in terms of the transaction so that you're not faced with an automatic termination of the contract. Of course, the parties could always agree to move forward with it. It's just, you know, when you see language like this that sounds like it's an automatic termination, try to avoid it if you can. T is pre-closing occupancy by buyer. And of course, our next one is going to be post-closing occupancy by seller. So we have a similar situation that we're going to, within 10 days after the effective date, which is a little more reasonable than 5, but probably still pretty ambitious to think we can do this within 10 days after the effective date. The parties are going to go and talk to the lawyer and get a lease drawn up. Anytime there's an occupancy by somebody who doesn't yet own the property, or by somebody who doesn't still own the property in the case of the seller, we need a lease. We need a lease to document that tenancy, right? And so we're going to say that they're going to go to the lawyer, they're going to get the lease drawn up. If they don't, right here, the last paragraph, and the buyer has not yet taken occupancy, then either party can terminate the contract. So we're going to say, here's the date where we want all of this done. And here's when the buyer is going to take possession. If we don't have the lease and the buyer hasn't taken possession yet, then either party can terminate the contract. All right, stop share. And let me find my next set. Any questions while I'm in the process of changing out here? Okay. So here's our next one. And this is the one that I told you, post-closing occupancy by seller. Same thing, only we're counting backward from the closing date instead of forward from the effective date. And it says 10 days prior to closing. So we want to get this done at least 10 days prior to closing, right? And we're going to specify the number of days that the seller is going to occupy post-closing. The parties are going to go to see the lawyer, get the lease drawn up, everything's in place, right? If they don't, second paragraph here, then either party can terminate the contract. I know people are tempted to just write something in additional terms about it, but you really do need a lease in place to address all the liability issues, because lots of things can happen, either occupancy pre-closing or occupancy post-closing, and a lot of people can be very disappointed with the results. So it's always good to have a lease in place. V is sale of buyer's property. So we see this a lot, right? The buyer needs to sell their current property in order to buy the new property. So we're going to put the address of the current property. We're going to say the date by which it needs to close. And then we're going to indicate whether it is or is not currently under contract. In either instance, as soon as it is under contract, then the buyer needs to provide a copy to the seller. We're going to take out mark out the information like the names and the price and all that, but everything else should stay there, because it even says that in the fourth line, I guess, in the first paragraph. The party's identification and purchase price information will be obliterated. So we don't reveal everything, but we want to give the seller enough information to feel secure that, yes, it is under contract. And we've also developed a version for purchase of the seller's new property, if anyone has seen that or if you knew that. Backup contract, get a lot of questions on this. So in this market where there are lots and lots of offers, right? Some of them may come in as backup. And so what this is saying is, you know, if the one you're with now falls out, then choose me next, right? And the interesting thing about this is that you can put an expiration date. So it says that unless the seller has notified you that you're in first position by 5 p.m. on, and you fill in the blank for the date, then the contingency is removed and the backup contract is no longer, right? So if they haven't notified you that you're in first position, the buyer can always withdraw this, right? They're not obligated. And so that's what a lot of people do. They use this. So they're like, okay, well, maybe we'll get this one. In the meantime, we're going to continue to look. And then boom, the next thing you know, they have a contract. They're in first position. They can withdraw this. Pardon me. They can withdraw the backup contract, because even though it says contract, it's really not. It's just an offer. It doesn't really become a contract until the seller notifies you that you're in first position. Does that make sense to everybody? All right. Kickout clause. So this is the seller's version of the backup, right? So this is the one, and you probably heard me say it. It's the, I came to the party with you, but I might be leaving with somebody else, addendum. So buyer submits the offer. Seller goes, well, I guess I'll accept it, but I'm really hoping something better is going to come along. So I'm going to use the kickout clause. And what it says is, buyer, if I get a better offer as the backup, then I'm going to notify you, and you need to put more money into escrow, and you need to waive the contingency for financing and for the sale of your property. Well, how many buyers can do that, right? So it's pretty harsh. And buyer, if you don't do that, then you're out, and I can get the new offer that I like better than yours. Has anyone used that or had it used on you? So this one and the next one are very similar. This is the seller's attorney approval. And it says that the seller can have their lawyer review and approve the contract. And we can have until X date to make that happen. If the lawyer disproves the contract on or before that date, then the seller has the option to terminate the contract. It's not an automatic termination, but the seller can choose. And then we have the same thing with the buyer's attorney approval. Buyer has the right to have their lawyer review and approve. If the lawyer doesn't approve the contract by the date that we specify, then the buyer can choose to terminate the contract. So you've probably heard me say this before. It bears saying again, don't make up these, especially these, right? Because it's so easy just to use the addendum. And I've seen agents who write in paragraph 20 additional terms, contract is contingent upon review by seller's lawyer or buyer's lawyer. Well, review just means I get to read it. And doesn't matter if it's awful, and I'm going to advise the seller or the buyer, don't ever sign that contract, don't do it, terminate. If all I have is the right to review, that's not the same as the right to approve, right? Words matter. And so make sure you use the addendum that goes for your particular situation. AA is licensee disclosure of personal interest. So this is for when you, as the licensee, have an interest in the property as an owner, or if you're closely related to one of the parties, right? So you're buying it, you're selling it, or somebody close relative is buying it or selling it. So I talked to someone earlier, and it was her brother who was the seller. I was like, yeah, you want to use this, you want to disclose it, right? Some close family relationship, you want to disclose. If it's more remote, you don't need to disclose it. Like, you know, your fifth cousin 3 times removed. No, that doesn't matter. So just ask yourself, is this something I would want to know if I were on the other side of the transaction? And then disclose it. No harm in over disclosing, right? And then addendum BB is binding arbitration. So in the contract, it says that if we have disputes, we're going to resolve them through mediation. However, if you remember, mediation is kind of like we have a mediator. However, it's not binding. And the mediator just tries to facilitate the resolution with the parties. It's entirely up to the buyer and the seller to decide whether they want to agree to the resolution or not, right? The mediator has no power to force them to agree. Arbitration is different because you see it's binding arbitration. We have a third-party arbitrator who comes in and decides for us, just like the judge in the court, only it's not quite that formal. And so this is to be used when the parties want to go to binding arbitration rather than go to voluntary mediation. So that's the big difference. Mediation, we don't have to agree. Binding arbitration, the third-party arbitrator is going to decide, and we must comply with what that decision is. And we are done. Wow, we got through them all. Does anybody have any questions about any of that? No? I saw a head. Any questions about any of those addenda? Any questions about anything else?
Yes, I do have a question.
Okay.
Are we getting the copy of these addendums just to have them? Because it's been times for me that I go into Command and trying to, through DocuSign, trying to find the right addendum, and it's sometimes hard to find what you're looking for. So if we have that, that would be great in our email, so we can go back and say, oh, okay, it was writer F or A or whatever, you know, we're looking for.
Yeah, I mean, if you want that, anybody who wants it, if you put your email in the chat, then I'll download the chat and I can send it to you. And I'm also going to put that document in that I mentioned. That's like the summary of all of the addenda. Somebody said, what's the name of the class? So we were talking about contract addenda. And let me find the document. If you just hold on 1 second. Okay, so I just put it's called contract addenda, and that's the summary of all of the addenda. It describes them, it goes into detail about all of the provisions, and it has some scripts about, you know, how you can talk to the buyer and the seller about them.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Yes, you're welcome.
Hi, Sally.
Hi.
Thank you for your time.
Yes, absolutely. You're welcome. How are you doing?
I'm great, hon. If you have just a little time, I've heard Murray's thoughts on this, but I haven't heard yours. Can you discuss multiple offers on the buyer and seller side, best practices and things like that?
And how to deal with them?
Yeah, what's the best way to protect our brokerage and ourselves on that?
So and interestingly, there was a question sort of like this that I saw in the Florida Realtor magazine. I came in the mail the other day and I was looking at it. And so from a listing agent perspective, I would suggest if there are multiple offers, do a spreadsheet. And the seller is not obligated to consider any offer. They can choose one and not look at any of the others. They can, do whatever they want, really. They don't have to consider them in the order in which they're received. However, just in terms of presenting things, I would suggest a spreadsheet, because then you can help the seller to analyze the terms, right? Because it's not all about price. It's terms and conditions. There are other things that the seller might want to consider, like, is it cash? Is it financed? What type of financing? What are the contingencies? All of those kinds of things. And I think a spreadsheet helps to keep track of everything so that the seller can really go through and help to decide which one is in their best interest. From the buyer perspective, I'm not sure there's a lot that a buyer can do when they're in a situation like that that's multiple offer, except perhaps, the escalatory addendum. I would discourage the letter writing. We've had some posts about that. I think everybody in the industry is discouraging the letter writing because there are lots of issues that can come up that we don't want to get into. The question that I saw in the Florida Realtors magazine was, the listing agent had multiple offers, and the seller chose one, and then one of the agents for a disgruntled buyer who didn't get chosen was like, well, we submitted ours first. The seller was obligated to negotiate with us first. No, they're not. The seller can negotiate in any order or don't have to negotiate at all. So I'm not sure I addressed the issue that you were asking about. Does that help at all? Was I close?
Well, yeah, I'm in a spreadsheet to present that, but I'm on the grievance committee with Aura, and I think probably 3/4 of everything we're hearing right now has to do with multiple offers and buyers and buyers agents' feelings getting hurt and angry and things like that. So I just think that, would you recommend always having a seller sign an offer and reject it or something like that?
They don't have to. They can just totally ignore it. But, in terms of making sure that you've presented the offer and all that kind of stuff, yeah, probably. That would be a good thing to do.
Okay.
Just have them on that last page, that they reject the offer.
All right. Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. Any other questions? Yes, hi.
How are you?
Good, how are you?
Good. I believe so about talking about, you said home insurance, I believe is a rider age. That's for the house, correct?
Yeah.
I know that some houses, they has an old roof, like you say, so all houses. I passed through, a few of those transactions, but I never filled out one of those to protect my buyer. And the way that I understand is if something goes wrong that I cannot get approved for, and even we already had the 30 days, 25 or whatever, days to approve it with condition, just to protect their deposit. I believe so, because if they cannot get it the way that I think, then we get the money back because the lender is gonna decline their loan, saying that they are not approved because they couldn't get that. Am I right or wrong? I don't know. Do I have to use that one?
So, yeah, I mean, the lender could deny the loan based on that. However, what if they don't, and the insurance is more than what the buyer would be willing to pay? And so that's what that addendum protects them from.
Okay, okay, this is more, no, for the lenders, okay, I got it. The other one that I have is like post occupancy. I know that I did a couple of times. I know that I used the addendum, but the seller and buyer, they never agreed to, between them, to do any lease agreement or something like that. And I believe so that, you know, the group that we are here probably, I don't know if they do it or not, but most of our agents, we don't do it. So that's going to affect to us if something goes wrong between, you know, something breaks or I don't know, that can we get sued or not?
Potentially, yeah.
Even if we already have the addendum that they signed between them that agreed to stay 10 days or 5 days after the clause, because we don't sign for it.
I mean, if depending on what the language is, if it addresses, you know, who's responsible for any damage to the property during the occupancy.
Okay, the addendum usually we mark is both for seller or buyer. Yes, okay.
Yeah, yeah, but if, you know, if there's a lot of damage that happens and one party or the other is not happy with the way it worked out, then they could always point fingers back at you as an agent and go, well, you didn't advise me right. You're responsible for the damage.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, just, you know, little things that, you know, it's like when you have an insurance are good, but when you have it and you're going to use it, that's one of the things. And then I know the gentleman that I spoke before about the multiple offers situation. It's just an idea, the way that I did my last couple of listings that I had this month. I had 28 offers in one and 38 in the other one.
Wow.
The only that is just a simple, I know that in Keller Williams, we have a good system too that we can use in command.
Yeah.
But you are in a different, maybe brokerage, just a simple email to the sellers and just put offer one and they just put for sale like a price, you know, just like a 5 or 16 or whatever. You just copy and paste and only you just change it, send that to them. And of course, I tell them how to email to you each of ones of the offers. You don't have to see it, but at least you send it to them. It's going to be much easier for them. That's the way that I did. It takes maybe an hour to do it.
Yeah, yeah, that's, you know, however you want to send it, but just to make sure that they have it, and then it's up to them if they want to consider it or not.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. All right. Well, thank you everybody for being here. If you think of any other questions, let me know. I'm going to download the chat right now. So that the name of the class was Contract Addenda. So I'm going to save the chat, and that way I will have your email addresses. I'm probably not going to get it sent out this afternoon, but I will get all of those addendas sent out to you. And if you have any other questions that you think about, just let me know. Awesome. Okay. Bye, everybody.